Hello, everybody, and welcome to Early Societies. And we're going to look at specialization and systems. And this will set up our discussions for later societies because a lot of these systems kind of reemerge after the Bronze Age collapse. Essentially, we're going to look at how the Bronze Age was really an awesome time to be alive, right up till it wasn't. Now, first, early settlers were beginning to emerge about 10 or 11,000 BC. These complex societies emerged as specializations became more efficient. You had somebody who could weave, hunt, raise food, and lead. And essentially, this made the settlements very successful. Specialization makes these societies much more stable and generally materially more wealthy than their nomadic or semi-nomadic counterparts. It does, however, have a downside with that wealth in that the wealth becomes unevenly distributed. In nomadic societies, there really wasn't that much of a material difference between a leader and just a normal everyday member of the tribe. However, when you get settled societies, you start having that not only physical different distance, but also material distance, comfort distance, life expectancy distance, even. Some societies do eventually evolve into larger settlements. They become villages, those villages become towns, those towns become city-states, and sometimes those city-states go on to become kingdoms or even empires. Now, the reason why some of these can do that is because they begin to have specialists who can come up with technological solutions to solve problems, which allows humans to be more efficient and more productive, if we're looking at it from a purely economic point of view. It also solves some problems. For example, uh, terraforming. Most of the time when you go to a field that hasn't been touched by human hands, there's a lot of trees or shrubs or animals or maybe even rocks in the way that make it very difficult to till the land, at least not reliably. So you have to be able to shape that land. We do it in many ways. We can do it by digging canals for irrigation. We can cut down some of those trees, so deforestation. We also may set aside certain lands for animals. So we may clear trees but leave grass. In other ones, we might be clearing to grow wheat or barley or rice. So we have to clear that grass and set it up for this desired plant. We literally begin to reshape the surface of the earth in many locations worldwide, literally terraforming. We make it obey us. We make it more conducive to supporting our lives. Hand in hand with that terraforming comes urbanization, or the creation of complex cities or complex settlements. They are dependent upon agriculture, dependent upon that specialization, people being able to weave, being able to hunt, being able to lead. We also begin to see the emergence of a central authority in most places. There are very few ones that have decentralized authority. The majority do have some kind of king or leader. And of course, we begin to see the emergence of military might. Cities worked, and they continue to work because they concentrate people and money and resources in one central location. Imagine if you had to complete your daily job of providing for your family and, let's say, creating something. If you had to trek miles every day to get the resources that you need, more miles every day on foot to get the place that is most optimal to work, more miles even to get away from predators or from hostile foreigners, and so on. So it doesn't really make it very efficient. If, however, you only have to go a few blocks, maybe 10 minutes of walking to get your materials, go to another 10 minutes to begin working, and you don't have to worry about invasion or wild animals attacking you, makes it much easier to do your job. Now, societies are predicated upon systems. In other words, there are problems that arise that need some kind of solution. That solution is usually not a one-off solution. It is usually one that needs to be maintained. And that maintenance creates a infrastructure, if you will, to keep that solution going and to keep the problem at bay or perhaps even address it. For example, there are certain things that are associated with people living together. One of the things is everybody has to go to the bathroom. So if you're living in a large settled place, how do you deal with that? Because if you leave it in place, you're going to get sick. So you need to protect the health, security, and happiness of your people. Your solution does cost society, maybe not in the same way of getting sick or having a lot of poop laying around for people to get sick from, to smell, and to basically befoul your city. So that's going to cost money. So a good example would be some kind of toilet or some kind of sewage system. But that will break down over time. So you need specialists who can maintain it and repair it if need be. So that's a cost to the society. A society must bear that cost. The failure to bear that cost may result in some really unpleasant side effects, like perhaps rebellion or famine or even disease. So if you don't solve these problems, the system breaks down. Now, all societies are predicated upon these types of systems. There's a problem, you need a solution, you come up with a solution, there's a system in place, perhaps a new problem emerges, and so then you have another solution, and maybe that solution overlaps with the previous one. And so what you have is essentially a increasing complexity. Think about roads. If you're building a road from point A to point B, that's relatively simple. But if you're building roads to interlink your entire kingdom, so that farmers can get to markets, so that your troops can move to the borders, so that you can patrol one city and another. Then you have increasing complexity. These systems become intertwined and they create new problems. These new problems result in more complex solutions. These more complex solutions create more complex systems. More complex systems means higher costs. A good example of this would be a dirt road. Dirt roads are relatively easy to maintain. They're fairly easy to make as well. You basically just clear off some of the rocks and the plant matter, and maybe you grade it a little bit or widen it, and then people can use that road. And just by using it, they kind of help maintain it. But with dirt roads, you've solved one problem of moving from one point to another a little bit more easy. But what happens when it rains? Well, when water hits dirt, you get mud. And if you have a lot of people walking on a muddy road, it creates ruts and problems there. So now you have a more complex problem than just not being able to go from one place to another as if you're walking over land. So you need a more complex solution. Perhaps your solution is to put stones down. Well, now you have a more complex solution that's going to be more expensive. Somebody has to quarry that stone, cut it, lay it. There has to be surveyors. There has to be people who keep that road nice and level. Otherwise, you wind up with ruts and potholes. And those wind up being problematic as well. So you can see what I mean. Sometimes these costs become more and more complex. It makes it harder for societies to bear these costs, but if they don't, the failure to bear these costs can be more expensive than actually just fixing the problem. An example would be of complex systems. Another example would be the transition from stone implements or the lithic periods. Lithos meaning stone. You have the Neolithic period, that is the most proximal period or the nearest period to the Bronze Age. The Neolithic period, stone was relatively plentiful. It was a found material and is the namesake for the three ages of stone. So Paleolithic means old Stone Age, Mesolithic means middle Stone Age, Neolithic means the new Stone Age. So if you have stones, you can make hammers, you can make axes, you can make arrowheads, these sort of things. And they're plentiful and they're relatively cheap to produce. The problem is, of course, that if you make a mistake with a stone implement, if you chip the wrong way, or if it breaks while you're making it, it fractures in a way that you don't expect, you have to start all over. You have to find a new material, you have to find a new stone that's appropriate, and of course, stone has limited usefulness. Other materials later on are more useful for certain functions. So by the end of the Neolithic period, we have the use of horn and bone for needlework, for sewing, for the creating of weapons in some cases. So stone is not a really good material. It's a very good beginning material, but not one for a complex society. Bronze is more complex. It solves some of the problems of stone. For example, it is a versatile, durable material. If you make a mistake while crafting bronze, you just put the bronze back in the smelter. It melts and you start all over again. You cast. It's much easier. You can recycle the material. It has a wide variety of uses. You can make bronze needles, you can make bronze axes, you can make bronze shields and armor, you can make bronze arrowheads and cart axles and that sort of thing. It is a difficult alloy to come by, however, because you have to combine two different materials that are relatively rare in the mantle or the surface of the earth. And so you have this need for multiple types of different mines, hoping that you find deposits or trading away for some of it. So bronze does answer some of the questions for stone, but it also presents other problems as well. Bronze is a very powerful and very valuable material. In fact, Bronze Age societies begin to emerge in the Mediterranean roughly about the same time, starting with the Egyptians, roughly 6000 BCE, followed by the Mycenaeans that are a little bit later to the game, and then finally the Hittites that are situated in Turkey that are about the same time as the Mycenaeans. Now, these three great civilizations leave some impressive remains behind. They leave some incredible ruined cities and even messages, written languages. They all independently come up with them themselves. Now, the Bronze Age was very much a top-down kind of hierarchy. At the very bottom, you have slaves, which provided free or near free labor. Now, slavery in archaic times and even classical times is not entirely similar to American recollections of slavery in the 16th to 19th centuries. But there are enough parallels. Yes, human beings were exploited for their labor. They provided the majority of the labor, so this was not good for them. They worked in mines, which was usually very dangerous, very uh, back-breaking work. They worked in salt mines. They worked in in copper mines, in tin mines. They worked in farms. Above them, you have people like farmers, the ones who provide the majority of the food. They tend to be free or semi-free. They have a few more rights, a little bit more freedom than slaves do. Above them, you have artisans, the people who craft things, basket weavers and swordsmiths and doctors and that sort of thing. Above them, you have the people who keep everybody safe. And you notice that we're getting fewer and fewer people as we go up. It's very pyramidic structure. The warriors are specially trained. In this era, in the Bronze Era, you have professional soldiers, something you don't have again until the medieval period. And actually well into the medieval period, we have professional soldiers. Although I should actually back that up. The The Romans do have professional soldiers, so not until the classical period. Priests are taking care of the mental and spiritual well-being, interpreting the will of the gods, reading the signs of the universe, and in many cases, priests and scientists and doctors overlap a little bit here. Now, I know I mentioned doctors before and artisans, but those are more like the triage nurses, the actual physical surgeons, the ones who start coming up with medicines, they tend to be in the more priestly caste. So you have a couple of different levels of them. And then finally at the top, you have some kind of king, some kind of emperor, some kind of leader. And this is usually true throughout most of the societies. It's true in the Mycenaeans, it's true in the Hittites and the Egyptians, and even when we go to look at Mohenjo-Daro and the Central Asian societies of the Indus Valley, when we look at China as well, you have some kind of king or emperor at the very top. Now, the Bronze Age was actually pretty awesome compared to the Neolithic period, in that you have some highly specialized societies that emerge. And we'll see how complex they are in just a little bit here. We also have a high level of material wealth, especially compared to others, to smaller settled societies in Europe and in Africa, as well as the nomadic peoples. Now, there's some caveats with that. You'll notice there's asterisks next to these, and we'll get to that on the next slide. There's a moderate level of security compared to other societies, to smaller ones, of course, and a fair level of literacy. And again, we have another caveat. And here's those caveats. Bronze Age empires were, in general, more wealthy than any collection of smaller settled or non-settled societies, but that wealth is increasingly unevenly distributed, especially when you consider the majority of people living in those societies were either slaves or farmers of some kind who had very little rights and very little wealth. It would not be unusual for uh, someone on the bottom rungs of that society to not have any money at all, or even rarely see a coin, some kind of money for them to use. Often there was an exchange of labor or an exchange of crops for their taxes. There was obligations that they had to fulfill. Security from invasion, crime, famine, disease, and pestilence was by far generally better than smaller or non-settled societies. This is partly because you have a larger surplus population. If you have a settlement of 100 people and 10 people die from a disease, you've just lost 10% of your population. But if you have the same loss at a settlement that has 1,000 people, it's only 1% of your population. It really could take that hit in stride. You also have better governmental intervention, especially in things like pestilence. When you have plagues of locusts attacking your crops, either the government will come in and supplement your losses. They will give you food to keep you alive. They will restore your grain. They will erase your debts, that sort of thing, in order to ensure that you can continue, say, next year when there hopefully are no locusts, they can continue to function as a farmer. Literacy emerged in the Neolithic periods out of necessity because these societies began to be more complex and you couldn't relate and remember all of the different moving complex answers. And record keeping becomes more and more important. You get the emergence of these scribes, which typically tend to be in the higher levels. They tend to be artisans and above. Scribes are important. In fact, they are pivotal in ensuring things like proper crop yields, tax collection, enforcing laws, disseminating decrees, engaging in religious teachings, propagating knowledge about medicine and that sort of thing. But again, it is limited to highly specialized scribes. All you do as a scribe is you take notes. You're basically data entry and transmission. So you're taking notes, you're managerial, you're kind of very clerical work. Now the bronze, as I mentioned before, becomes very, very valuable. In fact, bronze as that alloy of tin and copper with some other elements thrown in to give it different characteristics. For instance, if you wanted a really hard edge, you might add a bone, which adds phosphates to it, which kind of gives it a more rigid structure so that the edge can keep longer, or things like that. But there's a problem. Deposits of copper and tin are very haphazard. For example, Egypt had relatively rich deposits of copper, but by itself, copper is a very soft material and actually not that much better than using stone. Stone tools actually started being used to build temples and early pyramids. Hittites, on the other hand, who are living in what is now modern-day Turkey, they have deposits of tin, especially on the island of Crete, and they have very little in the way of copper. So being able to trade back and forth and then create bronze was a very highly valued skill. One of those artisans who probably made quite a bit of money. Was a very valued skill. It's kind of like being able to program or to be a materials engineer now. Bronze becomes the kind of standard of trade. I know lots of times we think about gold being the most valuable, but in reality, often bronze was worth its weight in gold. This is partly because of the wealth of gold that Egypt had. Egypt had a lot of gold, a lot of food, had some sophisticated pottery that it would engage with trade in order to get that bronze. The Hittites, they also had food that they would trade. They also had gems, as well as the much needed wood. They had control of vast forests and tree resources, and wood was exceedingly necessary in this period. Mycenaeans had wool, fruits and vegetables, as well as slaves that they traded, slaves that they would capture either from other nomadic Greek tribes or from further up in Europe. And so you have this very complex movement of goods throughout the Mediterranean. And trade increases access to each other's societies, which helps disseminate knowledge, luxuries, it accelerated discoveries, and of course, increased the general material wealth of all three societies. And trade had a very stabilizing influence. Nobody wants to mess with the good trades. However, occasionally that trade could lead to war. For example, if suddenly the Hittites decide that they're not going to export as much tin as they used to, this might prompt the Mycenaeans or the Egyptians to declare war to secure those sources of tin because they need it to keep feeding their military machines or their technological machinery. Not literal machinery, but systems, I should say. So the systems benefit large societies more. The more complex, and I know I kind of gave you a scary picture about how tangled and intertwined and expensive these systems are, but they wind up creating this great infrastructure or this great kind of scaffolding for the larger societies so that large societies could weather disruptions that would absolutely destroy and wipe out smaller civilizations. Things like famine. Famine until, well, even today, there is widespread famine. Famine is the shortage of food, not the inability to grow food, but just the shortage of food availability. So, to address the issues of famine, often those taxes that were taken. Remember, I talked about taxes being the harvests that you have, a portion of your harvest. Well, that wasn't just cause. It wasn't because they could come in and take it. Part of it was they could come in and take it, but it was also a little bit of foresight because they knew if they stored the grain, because grain, if kept in a cool, dry place, lasts for years. If they stored that grain, when a famine comes along, they can feed the people. And that's it. It comes back. Those taxes come back. Taxes benefit people, even though we don't like to pay them. Floods, for example. will be another disaster that would wipe out an entire village if an unexpected flood came along. There's a reason why. There's a recurring theme of flood motifs in creation theory throughout the world because floods are unpredictable, they're devastating, they sweep away the old order, they can change rivers, courses, they can wipe out entire cities very quickly. Invasions, you have a nice large standing professional army that can protect you from invasions because the more wealthy you are, the more outsiders want to come in and take what you have. A good example of this would be Egyptian chariots. This is a complex machine, and I mean that in the literal sense, that would be the Bronze Age equivalent of a jet fighter. They were extremely fast. They were powerful. They were devastating upon the enemy. They were also expensive and piloted by very highly trained specialists who worked all the time on being charioteers or being javelin throwers or being archers. Usually there was a two-person component to the chariot, one who was driving and one who was shooting. They would zoom into the enemy lines really super fast. They would let off a volley and then they would peel away and zip away before the enemy could respond. Another good example of this complex system that was able to benefit the larger settled societies more is the priestly caste. Priests interpreted the signs of the gods. They also made sense of the world. They provided comfort. They provided a sense of control over the universe. And they were basically paid to provide services. You can think of them as psychological counselors, physicians, confessors, people who helped mediate disputes, that sort of thing. Large societies could also afford complex, expensive systems to solve problems. A good example of this, and we'll see this a little bit in Central Asia, is sewer systems. Those they actually existed in the Bronze Age. I know we like to think that sewer systems are a relatively recent invention, or indoor plumbing is a relatively recent invention, but no, it's not. Thousands and thousands of years ago, our ancestors decided, hey, this is pretty cool being able to turn a tap and get some water in my house. They could also predict floods, ward off disease. They could keep efficient records and keep the society going. It is amazing how stable these societies are, especially if we look at Egypt. And this large level of organization would not be equaled until we get the emergence of medieval empires like the Frankish Empire, some nearly 2,000 years later. So this is how fragile and unique these complex systems are. There are many systems, things like chariots and fortifications and temples and irrigation and roads and walls and statues, responses to pestilence and plague and war, all of it resting on the shoulders of scribes, educated people who specialized in writing. And it had no other use outside of keeping these complex systems going. If you think about the zombie apocalypse, if you think about like Walking Dead kind of thing, or if you think about the end of the world, have you ever seen any like Mad Max movie? You never see the guy who writes stuff down. You always see the guy who fixes things, or the guy who fights things, or the guy who shoots things, right? Never the guy who writes things down. It's always the more practical aspects, and that's how important they are, but also how dependent upon those complex systems they are. So without the systems, the scribes don't exist. Without the scribes, the systems don't exist. And let me show you how this expresses in a very practical, real sense. There is a temple in Upper Egypt called Kamambo, and it's at a bend in the Nile River. Now the approach to it is these stone steps that go descend directly into the Nile. And so it allows you to pull right up to the temple no matter whether the river is riding high or riding particularly low. And the temple is divided into two parts. On one side, you have the evil god Sobek, the crocodile god. And on the other side, you have the good god of Horus, the falcon-headed god who protects life. And on the side that has Sobek the crocodile, we have the stairway that descends down into the sub-basement of the temple. And it has a shape that it was particularly chosen by the ancient Egyptians. And on the side of Horus, we have this strange keyhole-shaped well. Now they could have made it perfectly round, but they decided to make it this shape with this flaring out bottom. And these shapes are evocative for a reason, because they look just like the gods they represent, crocodiles and life. A little bit of mysticism mixed in with science. So what makes it so important? What makes that stairwell and that well so important? Well, Kamumbo not only acted as a temple, but it also acted as a Nile gauge or a Nileometer. It would be able to predict when and how badly the Nile would flood, or if the Nile was going to recede and how badly it would recede then. So both the Nile both gives and takes away life. So it's both evil and good. Therefore, the temple is both evil and good. And the measuring of the Nile is both evil and good. Now, in order to build Kamombo Temple, you needed engineers, architects, mathematicians to design it. You needed masons, laborers, surveyors, supervisors to build it. You needed more laborers and ships and leadership to supply the stones that was used to build the temple. You need even more laborers, even more stone cutters, and you need quarries to provide the raw material to begin with. You need artisans and metal or stone to make the tools that would be used to excavate the stone, to transport the cut pieces, to put the pieces in place, and to fit them perfectly, as well as to measure them. Once it's up and running, you still need mathematicians, priests, and scientists that can conduct observations and keep the temple going. You have priests and physicians who tend to people. If you were ill, you came and saw a physician. You also had people to maintain and keep the grounds and temple in repair. Merchants and growers to supply the food for the priests and the people who came to the temples. And you also had teachers who were employed to train new supplicants to the priesthood, new scientists, new physicians, new priests. So you see how complex just this one little temple seems to be. And you get a glimpse at the systems that are in place. And because of that, because of these complex systems, we get some amazing discoveries in the Bronze Age. A good example of this would be what is known as the Edwin Smith papyri, or the Edwin Smith papyrus. Papyrus is singular, papyri is multiple. It is carbon dated to around 1500 BCE, and it is used as a kind of medical manual. It is about surgery and surgical applications, about how to do certain things, about how to diagnose things, things like fractures. You can think people working with stone, people working with great heights. There's going to be fractures. Even just playing around, there might be fractures. Wounds, whether from battle or from accidents or animal attack, as well as dislocations, abscesses, cancers, breathing disorders, that sort of thing. They even talk about tumors, and they describe fairly well tumors and how you can treat these. Some were treated with surgery. Yeah, how hardcore are you? You go for cancer surgery to remove a tumor in a period before there is any widespread use of anesthetic. That's pretty hardcore. Now, the papyri are this rational scientific approach that categorizes things in anatomical importance, at least according to the Egyptians. To them, the most important were head and neck injuries. Then, of course, comes torso injuries, and then least worrisome are the arms and legs. And unlike other treatises and tomes of their time, this doesn't look at spells or praying to gods or using mumbo jumbo. This is actual uh, clinical advice. They recommend things like powdered copper in the wounds to help promote healing. It was only recently discovered in about the 1840s that copper had antimicrobial properties. Same with silver. They also called for powdered silver in some wounds to make them heal. Silver also has antimicrobial properties. They talked about sutures and how to sew somebody somebody who was cut. They also talk about some diseases we can't treat, and so how to make the patient comfortable until they die. This is triage. This is battlefield medicine. And it was very sophisticated medicine. And in fact, it taught the reader how to come to grips with not being able to treat some injuries. Some ailments you can or will treat. Some ailments which they will contend with, they will wrestle with it. That's the actual word that they use, is to wrestle with it. So it's going to be a struggle. And then ailments which cannot be treated. Things sometimes you just can't heal somebody. And it was the use of advanced treatment methods, not just taking the word of the victim, but using palpation, like when a doctor taps on your chest and listens to your chest. They use pulse taking. They smell the wound and they look at the visual indicators of an injury. They talk about sutures for wounds, relieving pressure from fluid after head wounds. Yes, they actually drilled holes in people's heads to relieve pressure, and those people survived. We know because the bone continued to heal. So it obviously worked. They also talked about splints and immobilizations for breaks and using honey as an antibiotic, as a disinfectant. They talked about a lot of things. They even cross-listed a lot of these ailments with major organs like the liver, the heart, the brain, that sort of thing. So this is fairly sophisticated stuff, and they used fairly sophisticated copper implements, copper and bronze, as you see here in the illustration. So, as I mentioned before, these Bronze Age systems are incredibly resilient. And in fact, ancient Egypt is probably the best example of how resistant these systems are to outside shocks. To give you an example about how long-lived Egyptian society is, perhaps the most famous leader of Egypt is Queen Cleopatra. She was born closer to the time that we landed on the moon than she was to the time that the Great Pyramid was built in 2560 BCE. So she was living closer to when we were able to go to space than when they were able to build the pyramids. That's an amazing amount of time. America as a nation has lasted about 240 maybe years, around 240 years. Ancient Egypt's three kingdom periods lasted 12 times as long. And the Great Pyramids of Giza were the only surviving great wonder of the ancient world, and they were the tallest man-made structures in the world until the 19th century. So that gives you an idea just how powerful these societies really were. And it was a command structure, as I mentioned before. It's a top-down structure. There would be scribes who would come out to the farmers and instruct them how to rotate crops so that you would have maximum yield with minimum wear and tear on the soil. They also oversaw paying of labor, the collection of taxes, the dealing with crimes, taking care of invasions. This all comes from the top. The king would give an order to his ministers. The ministers would then give it to the scribes, and the scribes would go out. The priests often acted hand in hand. And this is true not just in Egypt, but also in Mesopotamia, in China, in India. It happens everywhere. They would also act as the voice of the gods, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. And they helped make sense of the world. They helped give a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Why did the Nile flood so much? Well, the gods really wanted you'd have a very fertile harvest. Oh, but I lost my house. That's okay. We're there to rebuild it for you. And so the world doesn't seem quite so hostile. So the Bronze Age was generally awesome. Minoan Crete, for example, had a vibrant culture with indoor plumbing, wealth from trade, a relatively temperate climate. The Mycenaean Greeks were skilled artisans who were recruited throughout the Mediterranean. They were able to use that wealth to create these gigantic, what are called cyclopean fortifications, these massive stones that were imposing walls. And they had splendid wealth. Hittite Anatolia had these massive, strong armies. They had huge harvests and a surplus of trade and a relatively high standard of living. And of course, ancient Egypt had deep reserves of gold, a stable society that lasted thousands of years, and scientific advancements that wouldn't be replicated until about the 18th century. It was awesome until it wasn't. Right around 1200 BCE to about 1150 BCE, every Bronze Age civilization in the Mediterranean began to collapse utterly. Some disappeared completely, like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Others retreated and became small rump states, smaller versions of what they were, the Hittites and the Egyptians, for example. And the reports from the time talk about widespread famine, war, disease, and raids from this mysterious group of people just referred to as the Sea People. So, what happened? Well, we don't really know because when the societies collapsed, much like when the zombie apocalypse happens in The Walking Dead, the people who keep records, their skills aren't needed anymore. And so languages disappeared completely. And so we don't really have that many records. We suspect that perhaps the bronze market became kind of uh, depleted, that maybe there was a scarcity in bronze. There may have been also some natural disasters, perhaps eruptions of volcanoes in the Mediterranean may have kicked off years of famine, which then destabilized these larger societies. Also, over farming, even with crop rotation, every time you plant a field, it takes certain nutrients out of the soil. Eventually, that soil becomes depleted and it takes a long time to rebound. It's a very small loss of investment over time, but eventually it does happen. There may also have been endless wars. These Bronze Age civilizations engaged in nearly as much war as they did trade, and they were at war off and on. Egypt, for example, constantly attacking Nubia and Kush, or being attacked by Nubia and Kush, attacking the Hittites or being attacked by the Hittites, attacking the Hyksos or being attacked by the Hyksos, that sort of thing. And of course, drought. We cannot underestimate the lack of rain will do to a society. The things that we do know is that craftsmanship and the ability to create sophisticated tools really declines for the next 500 years, from about 1200 to maybe about 800 BCE. So, for example, pottery. Pottery becomes less sophisticated, becomes much more utilitarian, less decorated. If you're just making a pot to boil something in, you don't need fancy works on it. You're probably going to use it day to day. There's loss of several forms of writing. The Mycenaean form of writing, the Hittite form of writing, the Minoan form of writing, they all disappear completely. Egyptian form of writing undergoes this massive change. The human skeletons that we excavate from these periods have a shorter lifespan. It seems to be widespread disease, and human societies change forever. So, who are these raiders that we kind of alluded to? Well, again, we don't know. They're just referred to almost uniformly as the Sea People. You can think of them as late Bronze Age, maybe Viking kind of people. Um, Ancient writings describe them as a completely unrecognized people. So this isn't a normal enemy. Maybe it's mercenaries who have taken to ship and have decided to wreak havoc or take advantage of some of the weakened states that they find. We don't know. But they did raid between 1200 and 1150 BCE until they disappear utterly. And of course, we don't know what happened to them because there's no writers left. 50 years after the collapse of a society, very few people are going to be writing notes to each other. And they may be a symptom actually of the systemic collapse of Bronze Age societies than they are the cause of the collapse. As these systems become increasingly complex and they become increasingly expensive, and as that expense is predicated upon maybe the use of bronze as a medium of trade or needing bronze to upkeep this when there's suddenly a shortage, maybe there's an economic collapse. That economic collapse causes people to lose confidence in their government, or maybe it causes the governments to be unable to pay their soldiers. Maybe some of those soldiers took part in some of these raids. We don't know. We're just speculating. So the Bronze Age collapse in some places was utter. A good example of this would be Greece. These large, powerful city-states were abandoned almost to the one. And it doesn't seem like they were really raided. There aren't any evidences of mass battles, fires, or anything like that. It just seems that they were just deserted because they no longer served their function. That maybe it was more efficient at this period of collapse to have smaller settled societies. The writing system known as Linear B, as I mentioned before, becomes incomprehensible. It's abandoned. Nobody knows what it means. Kings and chieftains are no longer able to command power or direct society, so you get the loss of a lot of those great figures. And smaller villages begin to crop up and disappear sporadically over the next 500 years in various places, some successful, some not. And so we go from this to this in the span of about 50 years. But eventually, all things must end. And we come closer to the classic period of the Athenian Greeks or of the Spartans. As we get closer to the Romans, as we get closer to the Carthaginians and more recognizable classic societies, we get to see villages and settlements emerge, but these emerge on defensible places in Greece and Anatolia, like on the tops of hills or far away from the ocean, like Rome does. The re-emerging successor kingdoms emerge in Egypt and Anatolia. The Egyptian kingdoms do continue to exist. They have different structures, but Egypt comes roaring back. Anatolia less so. These interior cities, the further away they are from, say, the Mediterranean, the further upriver they are, the further inland they are, they tend to function sort of. So you have these interregnums. These some cities are still functioning while others get to be abandoned. And new forms of government begin to emerge, and new writing begins to emerge. The classical Greek name for a city, polis, actually comes from the word for hill. So where do you want to live? Well, we want to live on top of the hill because it makes it harder to invade. It makes it harder for people to suddenly run in there and get what they want and loot and pillage and plunder and all that sort of stuff. Hieroglyphics give way to something called Demotic Egyptian, which is a kind of a shorthand Egyptian. So you don't have these elaborate hieroglyphics anymore. So what do we learn from this? Well, we learn that every society, no matter how stable, no matter how complex, no matter how sophisticated, can collapse if we allow it. If we become poor stewards of our society, if we disengage from our society, if we withdraw our support from the society, it will collapse. If we become jaded, if we become disaffected and disassociated with it. Complex, sophisticated societies are, in general, more robust than scattered, simpler societies. Often there's this kind of idealized version of the past that everybody lived simply and they were self-sufficient. Yes and no, but they were also very dependent upon the whims of nature. Scattered, simpler societies just don't have what it takes to suffer the ripple effect of disasters. I mentioned before the 10 people dying in the village of 100. That's a significant loss. But in a village of 1,000 or a village of 10,000, that's something you can take in stride. And also, not being careful guardians of these complex systems is probably the most impactful vice of any civilization. It happened with the Egyptians, it happened with the Hittites, it happened with the Greeks, it happens with the Mohenjo-daro, it happens with the Shang dynasty, it happens with the Romans, and on and on and on. Eventually, people begin to ignore and take for granted the miraculous systems that they have in place. They begin to devalue them because they've become so familiar with them. And when you devalue them, then they break down. And when they break down, the society breaks down. All right, guys, that is it for this week. Chapters 1 and 2 on McKay. Sources give you a deeper look. There are some weekly resources that are important for understanding settled societies. And if you have any questions, please email me.